All right, happy Monday. Welcome to week 2 of the Fairhaven Lecture Series. I'm filling in for Kari today. So originally from Philadelphia, David McKay has lived in Janesville ever since 1995. He holds a PhD in American history from the University of Iowa, specializing in the political culture of the early American Republic. So he actually does know what this country was founded upon, in contrast to the politicians cluttering up the airwaves in this election year. He has taught on or for 7 different campuses in the University of Wisconsin system, but calls UW-Whitewater at Rock County his home. His kids are in college these days, so it's just him, his wife, the cats, the rabbits, the chickens, and far too many books at home now. Let's welcome David McKay.
All right, thank you very much. I guess we'll just get started with a poll. How many of you voted for either Joe Biden or Donald Trump in the 2020 election? Raise your hand. Suckers. None of you did. Not a single one. Unless there is something very unusual about the people in this room, the plain fact is that none of you voted for either of these candidates. There are only 538 votes for president that count. And in a nation of some 330 million people, the odds are that yours isn't one of them. Those votes belong to a group of people known as electors, and you get to vote for them, if you're lucky. And they get to vote for president. And since 1804, they also get to vote for vice president, but that's extra. They meet in their respective state capitals to cast their ballots on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, sort of like Easter. This will be the 16th of December this year. And these electors are collectively known as the Electoral College, a deeply misunderstood institution in modern America. Unlike most colleges, it has no students, no faculty, no campus, no dorms, no football team, and very few cheerleaders, most of whom cannot do a split to save their lives. It's very much like the College of Cardinals that way, only without the little puff of smoke at the end. Although, wouldn't that be fun? For most Americans, the Electoral College is something of a mystery, an arcane and semi-magical thing that drops into their lives once every 4 years and then just as quickly vanishes before the next election. In the interval, it rarely gets explained and very few people ask for it to be. And the reason for all of this mystery is that the Electoral College is a holdover. It is a relic of the mental world of the Founding Fathers, a world that has not existed for over 200 years, not since about 1820. And which has been so thoroughly forgotten that most Americans have no idea that it ever existed at all. Things have changed. So what I want to do here today is twofold. First, I want to take a closer look at the Electoral College itself, what it is, how it works or doesn't work, as the case may be. And second, having established what precisely we're talking about, I want to step back and look at why the Founding Fathers would have put such a system in place at all. If you go around and ask people about the Electoral College, and as a historian I can do this because people already think I'm kind of goofy, you will quickly discover that not many people understand how it works. And this should not be surprising because the Constitution is actually rather vague on the subject. And that is by design. The Founding Fathers understood that a framework of government needed to set out broad principles and not dwell on the nuts and bolts of everyday, day-to-day administration. They were much better historians than modern Americans in general. They understood that times change. And to imprison future generations in a cage made of original intent, particularly at the level of operational details, especially since the Founding Fathers themselves disagreed angrily and at some length over what precisely the original intent actually was, to try to do that would be deeply irresponsible. The Electoral College, at its most basic level, is a body of men, and recently women, whose only task is to select a president and a vice president. And that raises a number of questions. First of all, who are these people? How do you get to be an elector? The Constitution does not say. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution simply says, each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress, but no senator or representative or person holding an office or trust of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed elector. That's it. That's all there is. It's all the guidance you get. So we know that the number of electors is determined by the Constitution. Wisconsin, for example, has 8 representatives and 2 senators at the moment, at least until the next census. So we get 10 electors. The Constitution also says that nobody with a federal job is allowed to be an elector. So we know who can't be one. Along these lines, the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868 after the Civil War, also prohibits people who have committed treason against the United States from being electors, though it does allow Congress to remove such disability, should they choose. So there are some restrictions on who can be an elector, and there's a limit on how many, but beyond that, pretty much everything else is up for grabs. These days, electors are chosen by the parties that are running presidential candidates. It's considered something of an honor, a reward for services rendered to the party. It's about one notch up from being a delegate to the nominating convention, and about a notch down from being named ambassador to some tranquil little vacation-oriented country should your guy win. If you've spent a few years knocking on doors, manning the phone banks, donating large sums of money, someone in the party higher-ups may decide to make you an elector. Your name then goes on a list of electors, a slate of electors it's called. The actual ballot will actually not have your name on it as an elector. It will have the candidate's name. But through some legal sleight of hand, it is understood by everybody that when the voter marks the space for the candidate, they're actually voting for this slate of electors. And that was the trick question at the beginning of the talk. You don't see the electors' names. You only see the candidates' names. So you think you're actually voting for the candidate, and you are, kind of, in a roundabout sort of way, but not directly and not necessarily. It's just easier on everybody if they put the candidate's name there. We're all about easy sometimes. As a general rule, most states work on a winner-take-all system, deciding which slate of electors gets to cast their votes. The citizens of the state cast their ballots. Whoever gets the most votes, they get all of the electoral votes. In Wisconsin, for example, in 2020, Joe Biden got 1.63 million popular votes. Donald Trump got 1.61 million popular votes. That's a margin of about 20,000 votes. That margin was checked several times on the insistence of the Trump campaign, and every time Joe Biden's margin of victory increased. So all 10 of Wisconsin's electoral votes went to Joe Biden. Winner take all. The thing is, though, it doesn't have to work that way. None of that is spelled out in the Constitution. Each state shall appoint in such a manner leaves an awful lot of leeway for figuring out who gets to be an elector and what they do when they get there. For one thing, it doesn't have to be winner take all. 48 states plus the District of Columbia work that way, but Maine and Nebraska work on a district system, where electors are chosen kind of like representatives. And under a system like that, it is entirely possible for a state to have some electoral votes go to one candidate and some for another. In 2020, 4 of Nebraska's 5 electoral votes went to Donald Trump, while the 5th went to Joe Biden. But 3 of Maine's 4 electoral votes went to Joe Biden, while the 4th went to Donald Trump. On the one hand, you sometimes will hear arguments that this sort of district system is more representative than winner-take-all, allows for more opportunity for a state's divided political vote to be represented in divided electoral votes. Nah. On the other hand, though, given the increasingly arrogant and shameless gerrymandering that one sees implemented by state legislatures these days when it comes to setting the boundaries of legislative districts, that's probably not true at all. In point of fact, the way it works as a practical matter, the Electoral College functions today as a way to gerrymander the presidential election. It skews the Electoral College toward rural voters who are overwhelmingly conservative, but who have not been a majority of the American population since 1919, and away from urban voters, who tend to be much more diverse. Under the Electoral College, the average Wyoming voter counts a little over 3.5 times what the average California voter counts. The Electoral College is basically affirmative action for conservative white men.
Oh, I'm going to
What can you do? The Republican candidate for president has won the popular vote once in the last 33 years. 2004. That is a record of rejection unmatched by any major political party in American history. And yet, we have had 3 Republican presidential terms in that period because the Electoral College is so gerrymandered in favor of rural voters who skew to the right. Look, prediction time. Donald Trump, in November, will lose the popular vote by 2 to 8 million votes, just like he has done twice before. It's been 8 years. Nobody has changed their mind. Nobody. The results will be exactly the same. And yet, because the Electoral College is so gerrymandered, he has a 50-50 chance of being president anyway. Think about that. If you really want a representative system that reflects the will of the American citizens, you would just abolish the Electoral College. You would let the majority of citizens choose their president the way they do for every other office in America. Everything else is just partisan politics and minority rule. But then, of course, there really isn't anything in the Constitution that says you get to have any input in the presidential election at all. Remember this? Each state shall appoint in such a manner as they choose. It is entirely constitutional for a state to leave the selection of its electors to the state legislature and not allow you, the citizen, to have any say in this whatsoever. And that was a common practice in the early republic. 9 of the 15 states did this in 1792. 10 of the 16 in 1800. As late as 1824, 6 of the 24 states still did this. The last time this was done was 1876 by the newly admitted state of Colorado, which simply didn't have enough time to organize an election. There are restrictions on this. If a state's going to do it this way, they have to have it in place. They have to have the law passed and the plan in place before the election. They can't just switch after the election if they don't like the way the citizens voted. But it's an option. You don't have to have any say in this at all. The bottom line is that the Wisconsin State Legislature with no input from you whatsoever, could, if they so chose, pick random people off the streets, select them by lottery or throwing darts at a phone book, if they can find a phone book these days, or choose them based on how much they have donated to the re-election campaign of Speaker of the Assembly Robin Vos. And as long as they set this up before the election, and the people they pick are not federal employees or traitors, those people will be electors with the full blessing of the Constitution. Interesting. All right, so one way or another we now have our electors. One way or another. What do they do? Well, here the Constitution is a little bit more clear, and it spells out a fairly straightforward process for what happens once the selection of electors has been made. The first thing after the election is that the electors meet to cast their ballots. There is no central meeting place. As noted earlier, they meet in their respective state capitals on the duly appointed day in December. The Electoral College, in other words, is an activity, not a place. Once they meet, the electors then cast their ballots for their chosen candidates. And the Constitution lets them do that however they choose. They can cast paper ballots, electronic ballots. They can throw color-coded marbles into buckets. They can do a specific interpretive dance for the candidate that they mention, as long as everybody understands that that's a vote. It's up to them. Now, as the Constitution was originally written in 1787, the electors would cast 2 ballots, one each for a different presidential candidate. They had to be different people. You couldn't do both for one. And the only requirement, other than that they be different people, was that at least one of those candidates had to be from a different state from the one you were voting in. Oddly enough, this is a restriction that is still in place. So this is one of those small but important things that candidates think about when they choose their running mate. Because if they're both from the same state, then that state's electors can't vote for both of you. From there, it was simple. Whoever got the most electoral votes would become president, and whoever came in second would become vice president. And this is a system designed for a world that has no political parties, which is the way the Founding Fathers felt that politics ought to be run. You get the second best candidate for the second highest office. 2 things happened to change that fairly quickly. First of all, parties happened anyway. And thanks to the second guy being vice president system in the original Constitution, in the 1796 election, the Federalist candidate John Adams won, became president, and his opponent, the Democratic Republican candidate Thomas Jefferson, was his vice president. And that worked as well as you'd think it would. Try to imagine the last 4 years with Vice President Trump, or the previous 4 years with Vice President Hillary Clinton. You get a sense that this is not really going to function very well. Second, as a result of that election, the parties developed the idea of running mates, candidates who would specifically run for vice president, not president. And that didn't work either. And the election of 1800 was an unmitigated fiasco because the Democratic Republicans forgot to have one of their electors not vote for the vice presidential candidate Aaron Burr, so he'd come in second. So Burr and Thomas Jefferson ended up tied. And from there it got ugly because Aaron Burr was an unprincipled scoundrel who was not about to give up a chance to worm his way into the presidential office, eventually both Virginia and Pennsylvania mobilized their state militias, ready to go to war if Congress tried anything funny, such as putting John Adams back into power, which is within their limits of things to do. Fortunately, Alexander Hamilton prevailed, Jefferson was elected, and the crisis was averted, although Aaron Burr would later murder Hamilton because of that. As a result, the 12th Amendment is quickly passed and ratified in time for the 1804 election, and this makes the vice presidential race a separate ballot. So you got one vote for president, one vote for vice president, not two votes and then a 1-2 system. So they cast their ballots. We got that far. Then they total them up, and they send the results to Congress. And there, the president of the Senate, who is, under the Constitution, the sitting vice president, or if that person's not available, then they go with the president pro tempore of the Senate. That person opens up the results and counts the ballots in the presence of the entire Congress. The vice president's role here is purely ceremonial. The only thing they are allowed to do is open and count the votes. They are not empowered to challenge or reject any of those votes, contrary to what you may have heard on January 6th, 2021. They have no such authority, and Mike Pence was aware of that. The first candidate to reach a majority of the total, which is 270 today, is declared the winner, regardless of the popular vote. 5 presidents, more than 10% of the total number of presidents, if you do the math, 5 presidents have lost the popular vote and become president anyway. The most recent being, again, Donald Trump in 2016, who lost by nearly 3 million votes. This is how we elect, doesn't matter. These are the votes that count. And all of that seems kind of clear, I guess. Maybe, sort of. It's more complicated than it needs to be, but you know, you can kind of work your way through it, kind of, with enough whiskey. But there are 2 further complicating factors here. First of all, there is always the possibility that nobody will in fact reach a majority of electoral votes. And the Founding Fathers actually figured that that would be the norm. But with the advent of political parties to discipline the electoral voters, it's become the exception. In recent history, there have been very, very few presidential elections that had more than 2 viable candidates. A 2-candidate race is always going to give somebody the majority, unless it's a tie, which is extremely uncommon. But that's not always been true. Several times in our history, the presidential election has been contested by 3 or more viable candidates. And while this usually resulted in somebody getting a majority, didn't always. In 1824, none of the 4 presidential candidates running got a majority of electoral votes. And John Quincy Adams, up there on the top right, the eventual winner, actually came in second. If nobody wins a majority, the Constitution says that the election goes to the House of Representatives, not back to you, the voter. Each state delegation casts 1 vote. Wisconsin gets 1 vote, California gets 1 vote, Wyoming gets 1 vote. In the Constitution, as it was originally written, the states could choose from the top 5 presidential candidates. The 12th Amendment dropped that down to the top 3. for reasons that probably made sense in 1804. Whoever gets the majority of these states is declared the winner, regardless of where they finished in either the popular vote or the Electoral College. John Quincy Adams, declared the winner by the House of Representatives in 1824, is still the only U.S. president to lose both the popular vote and the electoral vote and still become president. And his one term in office was about as successful as you would imagine, given that start. Under the 12th Amendment, the Senate gets to choose the vice president from the top 2 candidates, not the top 3, the top 2. And they do this by a majority vote of individual senators. So there's 100 votes, not just 50 today. There's nothing in the 12th Amendment that says the Senate has to pick the running mate of whoever the House mate chose as the winner. So it's entirely possible to have a president and a vice president of different parties if it goes to Congress. In 1824, there was only one serious candidate for vice president, John C. Calhoun. Everybody understood that no matter who became president, he was going to be second in command. Love the hair. The second complicating factor is that there's nothing in the Constitution that says an elector actually has to vote for the person they said they'd vote for. There are prohibitions. There are people the elector cannot vote for. Again, the elector cannot vote for a president and a vice president from the same state. We've talked about that. An elector cannot vote for a vice presidential candidate if that person is not eligible to be president. If you can't be president, you can't be vice president. But there's nothing in either the Constitution or federal law that binds an elector to vote for the person they've pledged to vote for. And until very recently, electors were considered federal employees beyond the control of state law, so federal law was the only one that mattered. There's even a term for when electors stray from their commitments. They are called faithless electors, which, if nothing else, tells you this does happen from time to time. There's a term for it. There have been 165 faithless electors in the course of American history, the most recent being in 2016. A faithless elector has never altered the outcome of an election. Never once. Faithless electors historically are extremely rare. Generally, again, how do you get to be an elector? The parties pick you because you're loyal, because you support the party, because you're going to do what the party tells you to do. But they can't force you. In recent years, that has actually begun to change. 33 states and the District of Columbia have laws on the books requiring senators to vote for their pledged candidate. But it was not until 2019, 5 years ago, that the Supreme Court overturned 2 centuries of legal precedent and the clearly expressed views of the Founding Fathers and decided that electors were now state officials, and therefore state laws could apply to them. Because prior to that, as the Constitution was written and intended, that was not true. But things change. 17 of the 33 states that have these laws will in fact void an electoral vote cast by a faithless elector. But the other 16 states and Washington, D.C. will not. Those votes will still count. And only in 2 of those states will the faithless elector actually be punished in any way. And in 17 states, there aren't any of these laws on the books at all, so they can vote for whoever they want. I mean, look, if they all decide to vote for Jordan Love, the Packers better have a backup ready to play, okay? So the bottom line here, what you have for choosing the most powerful office in the United States of America is a complicated and fragile system, easily gamed, that is utterly unlike anything for any other office in the country. It's a system that places an unelected body of officials between the American citizens and their chosen leaders, and does not actually bind those officials, that unelected body, to respect the will of the popular vote. And if the system fails, if the Electoral College doesn't actually choose a candidate, a winner, it doesn't default back to you, the voter. It goes back to another intermediary body, the Congress. Who thought this was a good idea? Well, the Founding Fathers, that's who. And the question is why? Anyone know the answer? Because the Founding Fathers didn't trust you. That's it. That's all it was. Doesn't it make you feel proud to be an American? I can feel my internal organs turning into assault rifles and bald eagles, even as I talk to you. Honestly, it's a bit uncomfortable. But you know, the Founding Fathers did not trust you, the common citizen of the United States of America, to select a proper candidate for the most important office under the Constitution. And therefore, they needed to put an intermediate body in there to watch over you and make sure you didn't screw it up. That's why it's there. Every 4 years, like clockwork, Americans rediscover the Electoral College. And every 4 years, there are calls to get rid of it because it sits athwart the will of the people, like a giant boulder in the path of democracy, limiting the ability of the common citizen to select the leader of their choice. You watch, I'll answer that. To which the Founding Fathers would have said, and? To them, this was a feature, not a bug. To understand why requires a long, hard look at the mental world of the Founding Fathers when it came to politics and how that world is different from the one we live in. All of modern American politics takes place in a very narrow spectrum of Lockean liberalism, so named for the guy who first systematized it in the 1680s, John Locke. There are no actual conservatives in America. We have right-wing liberals and we have left-wing liberals. We call the first group conservative for rhetorical convenience. But all Americans live in this 18th century definition of liberalism, whatever you want to call it. Look at that. I'm not just saying that. Lockean liberalism is the quintessential form of Enlightenment politics. It's what the Enlightenment looks like when it gets political. And it draws on the three fundamental principles of Enlightenment thought. First of all, it is based on reason. Lockean liberals will start with first principles and then figure out how the world ought to work from there. Right? Beat to fit, paint to match. The idea of equality is perhaps the best example of this. Equality is found nowhere in nature. But it is something that Americans believe in their bones, regardless of who you vote for. We insist that our society reflects this value, even when it clearly does not. It is something we believe ought to exist, and therefore something we believe does exist. It is based on universal natural laws. Lockean liberals firmly believe that this is the only proper system for government in the entire world, and this is why we try to put democracy in Iraq. And it's based on progress. Things can and will get better. Using our reason, we can work out the natural laws that govern human society and politics and use that to make progress. All Americans believe in progress. We differ, often quite vociferously, about what actually constitutes progress. But we all believe in progress, that it's possible that it happens. And from here, Lockean liberalism adds three other principles. First, that the individual is the fundamental unit of society. All society is set up to benefit the individual. Most political ideologies are based on groups. Conservatism, socialism, nationalism, they're all based on groups. Liberalism is about the individual. Now, who counts as an individual is a matter of some debate. At the time of the Founding Fathers, individual meant adult, white, man with property. That was an individual. Those were the ones who counted. You see, the property restrictions start to go away in the early 19th century. Technically, the racial restrictions disappear after the Civil War. Does take another century for us to get that even remotely like real, in the 1960s. Women don't count as individuals until the early 20th century. Children still don't. But that's a matter of negotiation, not a difference in principle. It is the individual, however one defines that term, that counts in liberalism, Lockean liberalism. Second, the primary function of society is to free this individual from restraints. Humans, says Lockean liberalism, are basically good. The job of society and government is to give them the freedom to do the right things without government coercion. And third, the most important thing individuals need is equality of opportunity, the level playing field, where they can all use their talents free from restraints to get ahead. This is not equality of condition. There's nothing here that says you'll end up equal. This is the equality of the starting line, not the finish line. Equality of opportunity. But either way, there you go. Now these ideas can be spun two different ways. And here we get to the part where you all kind of looked at me funny, but here you go. It all depends on what playing field you want to level. If you want to level the economic playing field, and you follow the logic long enough, you will end up with a firm belief in the sacred nature of private property, the importance of private interests, the need for a small and limited government, and the general rightness of laissez-faire capitalism, where atomized individuals are free from restraints to make use of their equal opportunities in the marketplace. Americans for generations have called this conservative. This is what we call conservative. It's just economic liberalism. That's all it is. If the playing field you want to level is political rather than economic, eventually you will end up at a firm belief in civil and political rights that must be protected by a strong and active government that has the right to step in and regulate society and the marketplace, and a strong emphasis on popular participation in government being extended to the widest number of individuals, however defined. And again, Americans for generations have called this liberal, but it's, again, they're both liberal. And I have messed with the formatting on this so many times and it keeps reverting. Darn it. Anyway. Either way, though, whichever side of that you fall down on, they all depend on the idea that individuals, however defined, have to have a say in their own fate. In other words, Lockean liberalism, whichever side of that you fall down on, insists that democracy is the proper form of government. The only form of government that matters is democracy, the will of the people. Vox populi, vox dei, and all that jazz. And under this system, the Electoral College is an anomaly. It's undemocratic. It puts an unaccountable third body between individuals and their choice of rulers. It is a check on the power of individuals to choose their own leaders. It does not fit in a world defined by Lockean liberalism. Founding fathers, however, were mostly not Lockean liberals. That comes later. Their world was not defined by Lockean liberalism. It was defined by republicanism, neo-Harringtonian republicanism, or classical republicanism, if you want to get specific. And in that sort of world, the Electoral College does actually make some sense. Republicanism is a much older ideology than liberalism. It has nothing to do with the modern Republican Party. That comes much, much later. We keep reusing words. It gets confusing. Where liberalism comes out of the Enlightenment, republicanism is a response to the political crises that come out of England in the 1600s, especially the English Civil War. English political thinkers looked at all of those upheavals and crises, and they got one big lesson out of it, which is that if any one group or person got too much power, they would destroy your liberty. That was the big lesson they got. Where the idea of equality of opportunity is what makes liberalism go round, the key idea of classical republicanism is the idea that there is this eternal conflict between liberty and power. They are opposites in a zero-sum game, where one side wins, the other by definition loses. +2 power, -2 liberty. It all sums up to 0. Imagine a pie cut into 2 pieces, one labeled liberty, one labeled power. You can divide that pie however you want. But the size of the pie never changes. And whatever side wins, the other side by definition loses. All the changes add up to 0. So if one piece gets bigger, the other piece must get smaller. And classical Republicans believed that of the 2 sides, it's always going to be power that gets bigger at the expense of liberty. Power, therefore, must be checked, or else it will eat your entire pie of liberty, leaving you with nothing but crumbs. You're going to have a lot of fun with the pie metaphor. Don't even ask about the whipped cream. Professional historians have to go lie down after talking about the whipped cream. Leave this to the professionals. Okay, fine. You have to check power to preserve liberty, right? Got that? So far? How do you do that? How do you check power to preserve liberty? What classical Republicans said is, if you're going to do that, you need a properly balanced government. Power must be divided, and the pieces balanced against one another. But that doesn't answer the question, does it? It just moves the question down one level. All right? To check power, preserve liberty, I need a balanced Republican government. What's that? And more importantly, what am I balancing in a balanced Republican government? There are 2 answers to that question. In a traditional classical Republican view, what you are balancing are the orders of society. Classical Republicanism, unlike liberalism, assumes a social hierarchy. There's no equality here. People are not created equal. They don't end up equal. They don't start equal. They don't deserve to be treated equally. It's a very hierarchical view. Instead, society is divided into 3 groups. There is the one, the most powerful, important person. There is the few, a small group of almost, but not quite that powerful people. And then there's the many, the great unwashed, the rest of us, you and me. In a properly balanced classical Republican government, each of these groups gets a branch. The one is the monarchy, the king and his representatives, royal governors and the military and so on and so forth. The few are the aristocracy, the nobility. And the many is the democracy, the rest of us, embodied in the legislature. A properly balanced government will have all three of these branches. And when all three of them are balanced, when each branch sticks to its own turf and doesn't stomp on the turf of the others, then power is checked and liberty is secure. And this changes a little bit after the revolution. We don't really have a one or a few in the colonial system, in the colonial America. All we have is many. But if you're a good classical Republican thinker, you've got to balance something. And eventually, they decide, the Founding Fathers work out to balance government by function rather than by social order. Government should be balanced according to what it does, not by who it represents. So the one becomes the executive branch, the president. The few become the judicial branch, the courts. And the many remain the democracy, which in this case becomes Congress. This is the system of checks and balances you all learned in 5th grade, right? Notice that democracy is 1/3 of this system, not all of it. In liberalism, it's all of it. Anything that interferes with democracy, therefore, is bad. This is only 1/3, and it's one part of a balanced system. Democracy in a Republican system has to stay in its proper bounds. Because if it gets out of its bounds and stomps on the turf of the other two, it will eat up your liberty, including the whipped cream. That becomes important when we get back to the Electoral College. Because that is the main question, after all. What happens when one of those branches gets out of control? What happens when they're not balanced? What happens, Republican thinkers called corruption. And that was a technical term, it's a jargon term. When you see 18th century writers talking about corruption, they're not talking about bribes, or hiring your children for high-power government jobs, or stealing classified documents and keeping them in your bathroom. They're talking about one branch of a balanced government getting out of hand and stomping on the turf of the other two. That's what corruption means. And then your liberty dies. But it dies in different ways depending on which branch goes amok here. If the one gets out of hand, you get tyranny. All right, a dictatorship. If the few get out of hand, then you've got an oligarchy, which is kind of like dictatorship by committee. A small number of powerful elites running things, small being defined as more than one, but less than a bunch. It's a technical term. If the many get out of hand, it's anarchy. When everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. And eventually the powerful come in and swoop down and destroy your liberty. And the bottom line here is that you have to have all three parts to have a Republican government, one, few, and many. Whichever variation you choose, the traditional version or the separation of powers version, you got to have all three. And as long as they stick to their own turf and can check the power of the other two, then power is checked and liberty is preserved. So, let us consider the Electoral College in light of this. When you look at it this way, it's clear that the Electoral College is not the anomaly that it is under Lockean liberalism. It is instead a perfectly reasonable body, whose purposes are fairly clear. The Electoral College serves an ideological function. It is a check on the many as they choose the one. Power must be checked. In order to preserve liberty, you have to check power. And the definition of corruption is for one branch to stomp on the turf of the other two. For the many to be completely in charge of picking the one, that's corruption. Because the one just becomes a creature of the many. He's a puppet of the many. Because you have to think about how to pick a one under the Constitution, how to pick a president. You got to think about that in a way you don't really have to think about picking a king. You know how to pick a king. You find the queen, and when she gives birth, there he is. Choosing a president is a little more complicated. It's also different from choosing representatives and senators or judges. The one is the most powerful figure in government, the president. Both the few and the many therefore have to have a say. If you leave that entirely to the many in a classical Republican system, that's corruption. So, the Electoral College is a temporary few, whose purpose is to make sure that the many do not screw up picking the one, and do not have complete control over choosing the one. It is therefore explicitly anti-democratic. It is a check on democracy, keeping it in its proper place, avoiding the anarchy you would get if the many got to choose all by themselves. The Founding Fathers simply did not believe that the many could be trusted with this decision without oversight. The Founders believed that the common citizen would be easily led astray by silver-tongued demagogues, authoritarian would-be tyrants, fearmongers who would take power by pandering to the worst instincts of the insensate rabble, then ignore the Constitution, claim immunity to all laws, and refuse to leave office when defeated in elections. They might even incite insurrection, overthrow the Republic itself. There is no vox populi, vox Dei under republicanism. The common people are fickle, subject to irrational passions and inexplicable enthusiasms, easily herded by those who prey on their fears and anxieties. And the job of the Electoral College is to prevent that. To interpose a body of, presumably, wiser, cooler heads who will ensure that the most important position in a balanced Republican government is not being given to someone unsuitable. This also explains why the Electoral College was designed as it was. It explains, first of all, why there's an Electoral College at all. I mean, okay, yeah, you need to check on the many, but why not just use something you've already got? Why not use the judiciary or the House of Representatives? Since that's where it's going to end up anyway, in the House. Why create this temporary body? Well, the answer is that it cuts down on conflicts of interest. The Constitution, just the same way that constitutions are supposed to be written by special temporary bodies just for that one purpose, the Constitutional Convention. So the sitting legislature can't just write it to keep themselves in power forever. Same reason, you need a temporary body to choose the president. Alexander Hamilton explained this in the Federalist Papers, number 68, which deals with the Electoral College. It meant there would be no time for outside forces or inside agents to arrange secret deals. There would be no temptation for a president to curry favor with the Electoral College, because by the time the next election rolled around, there's a whole different Electoral College. Second, it also explains the astonishing flexibility that is built into the Electoral College prior to the 2019 Supreme Court decision. The Electoral College was designed to judge the person whom the will of the many had chosen to be the one. And if that person was deemed unfit for the office, it was the job of the Electoral College, this temporary few, to overrule the fickle passions and interests of the many, to overrule democracy itself, and pick someone worthy. It isn't democratic. It's not meant to be. It's a check on democracy, so the few can have a voice in choosing the one. The Founding Fathers did not trust you. They put the Electoral College in there to make sure that the ordinary citizen does not mess up the most important office under the Constitution. And we don't understand this now. We don't live in a classical Republican world. We haven't lived under classical republicanism in over 200 years. It is an outdated relic of a bygone world. Republicanism was already being contested in 1787 when the Constitution was written, when the Electoral College was created. By 1820, Lockean liberalism will triumph, republicanism will fade away, and it will leave only the balanced republican government of the Constitution as a residue. And for the rest of American history, most Americans will have no idea that there was ever any other way of looking at the politics. And they will wonder why, every 4 years, this thing called the Electoral College rears its head. And now you know. Questions?
That's it.
Do you have any questions?